42% of American children are now born to unmarried mothers. That single number defines the American family more than any speech or law. It means the family line is broken for nearly half the next generation. In 1960, that number was just 5%. Families operated as their own sovereign unit with completely clear lineage rules. They passed down names and authority without state intervention of any kind. Then state legislatures across the country voted to end that arrangement. They passed no-fault divorce laws by overwhelming margins. Not a single state was forced. This is not a story about what was taken from the family. This is a story about what they gave away. To understand how extraordinary those votes were, you need to see what existed before them. The family, as understood before the late 1960s, created two separate systems of authority with two separate sets of rules. The family raised its children and passed down its name primarily through marriage and biological lineage. According to historical records, from the founding until 1960, approximately 95% of children were born within marriage. The concept of illegitimacy carried real legal weight. The modern form of state intervention did not exist in family matters the way it does today. Families funded and structured themselves through the father's income, property, and authority. In 1960, single-mother households were rare. Local communities and churches depended on intact families even more, drawing the vast majority of their social stability from that single source. The family and the state were not competing for the same child. They were operating in entirely different social economies. Two systems side by side, neither one dependent on the other. But the social separation was only half the architecture. The legal separation mattered just as much. Before the late 1960s, divorce was granted only on fault. Adultery, abandonment, cruelty, these were the legal grounds. A marriage stayed intact unless one party violated the contract. This was deliberate. The common law and statutes favored careful preservation of the family line. It provided a double advantage. It favored stable selection of parents and gave the family direct agency in shaping the next generation. Legal scholars of the era called it a design that protected lineage. Think about what that means structurally. If a parent violated his or her obligations, the law could pressure or enforce the marriage. The family had a seat at the table of its own destiny. They had a check. They had leverage. And they had it because the architects of the system believed, with good reason, that external forces would eventually try to swallow family authority. That was the system as it stood in 1960. Within a few short years, state legislatures across the country had begun voting to dismantle both pillars of it. The first major shift concerned no-fault divorce. This one authorized courts to dissolve marriages without proving fault. The reform had been proposed by progressive legal thinkers back in the 1960s, and the detail that matters most is who proposed it and why. Reformers sent the idea forward fully expecting resistance in many legislatures. They believed state lawmakers would never grant the power to end marriages so easily. The California legislature passed the first such law in 1969. Other states soon followed with their own versions. They walked into their own capitals and voted to change the fundamental rules. The family line as protected for generations relied on clear legal distinctions. Names passed through the paternal line in most cases. Inheritance followed legitimate birth. The term illegitimate was not merely social. It carried legal consequences that reinforced the incentive to marry and maintain the family unit. Property taxes and family law treated the intact family as the primary unit. States funded social services in ways that assumed family responsibility first. The federal government and state governments played limited roles in replacing fathers. The systems were separate. Families handled their own lineage. Governments handled broader public order. Neither depended on the other for the core function of raising the next generation. But that separation was deliberately dismantled starting in the late 1960s. The votes came quickly once the idea gained momentum. Legislators across the political spectrum supported the change in many states. They believed they were modernizing an outdated system. They believed they were freeing individuals from bad marriages. They voted in overwhelming margins in state after state. The proposal to remove fault requirements was framed as a compassionate reform. It addressed documented cases of spouses trapped in abusive or dead marriages. It promised fairness. It promised to reduce acrimony in court proceedings. Yet the speed with which it spread should have raised concerns. From California in 1969, the idea moved to other states within months and years. By the mid-1970s, a majority of states had enacted some form of no-fault provisions. The change was presented as technical and procedural. Few at the time discussed its impact on the family line itself. Alongside the procedural change came a linguistic one. They didn't just alter the rules for ending marriages. They changed the name and status of children born outside marriage. The legal and social category of illegitimate was phased out. New neutral terms took its place. The stigma attached to non-marital births was intentionally reduced. This was done with good intentions, to avoid punishing the child. But it removed one of the last structural incentives for maintaining the traditional family line. These early votes set the stage. The legislatures acted voluntarily. No one forced the ballots. They chose to surrender the old protections that had existed for centuries. The family was no longer a separate sovereign unit in quite the same way. The state was beginning to insert itself into the space where family authority had once stood unchallenged. What existed before was a system designed for continuity. The family line was meant to be stable. Names, property, and responsibility flowed in predictable patterns. Children knew their place in the lineage. Fathers had clear legal obligations and rights. The entire architecture favored the preservation of that line across generations. The votes came quickly once the idea gained momentum. State legislatures across the country began dismantling the old fault-based system. California led the way in 1969 with the first no-fault statute. Within months, other states followed. By 1975, more than 30 legislatures had enacted similar laws. The margins were not close. In many chambers, only a handful of lawmakers voted no. Across the adopting states, total opposition numbered in the low hundreds. Not a single state was forced or coerced into casting those ballots. Legislators walked into their own capitals and surrendered the legal protections that had guarded the family line for centuries. This is not a story about what was taken from families. This is a story about what they gave away. The second pillar fell alongside the first. They didn't just change the rules for ending marriages. They changed the name itself. The legal category of illegitimate was erased from statutes. Neutral phrases replaced it. Birth certificates no longer distinguished between children born inside or outside marriage. The reform was sold as compassion. It promised not to punish the child. State after state voted yes. The political weapon designed to modernize family law became the mechanism that broke the family line. What happened next is where the numbers start to accumulate. Within a decade of the first no-fault laws, the divorce rate doubled. According to Census Bureau data, the share of children born outside marriage climbed from under 5% in 1960 to more than 18% by 1980. Single-mother households multiplied. Federal and state welfare programs expanded to fill the gap. Conditional grants for aid to families with dependent children grew from tens of millions to billions. To receive the money, states submitted plans for federal approval. They matched funds. They accepted oversight. They complied with standards set in Washington. The pattern was established immediately. Money flowed from government down to families. Authority flowed from families up to government, one transaction at a time. The money never stopped growing. Billions became hundreds of billions after the welfare expansions of the 1970s and 1980s. By fiscal year 2020, total federal and state spending on family-related assistance programs exceeded $500 billion annually. Government funds now represent over 40% of the support structure for single-parent homes. Families cannot maintain basic stability without revenue that originates in state capitals and arrives with conditions attached. The average family now receives roughly $1.03 from institutions its lawmakers once designed to restrain. Courts administer child support orders that replace the father's direct authority. Schools and hospitals operate within programs tied to federal dollars. The family line that once passed through marriage and biological continuity now fragments under the weight of state-mediated support. Names still appear on birth certificates, but the legal and economic architecture no longer favors their continuity. Legislators who voted for the changes could not have imagined the scale. The reforms addressed real problems of trapped spouses and unfair stigma. In the short term, they delivered relief. Yet the architecture shifted permanently. Federal receipts for social services rose dramatically as a share of GDP. State budgets absorbed matching requirements and oversight. The machinery of dependence was assembled one appropriation at a time across decades until it became the primary support for millions of broken lines. Children born today face a system where the state has become the default provider when the family line fails. The numbers tell the story without emotion. Out-of-wedlock births now exceed 40% nationally. In some demographics, the figure surpasses 70%. Divorce rates stabilized at historically high levels even as the original justifications faded. The fiscal and legal separation that once protected the family was traded for dependence so gradually that the transition felt like normal evolution. States cannot administer their family courts without this framework. They cannot fund child welfare services. They cannot maintain the social safety net their residents expect without revenue and rules that originate outside the family itself. The patron arrived with requirements that shaped family policy from the outside. Families traded independence for support. The independence that once defined the family line is no longer remembered by most. The transformation tracked by scholars shows government involvement replacing private authority in measurable increments. Every new regulation represented a decision made in legislatures that no longer answered solely to the family unit. Every conditional dollar carried strings that directed priorities chosen centrally rather than locally. The records are public. The vote tallies are preserved. A handful of legislators said no. The rest said yes. And now families navigate the structure those votes created whether they know it or not. The Capitol buildings still stand. The legislatures still meet. The gavels still fall. But the authority that once lived in the family line left with those votes. It left because the people who held it chose to let it go. The fair objection. The system before the late 1960s was genuinely broken. Spouses found themselves trapped in abusive or irreparable marriages with no practical escape. The stigma of illegitimacy fell hardest on children who had done nothing wrong. No-fault divorce and the removal of the term illegitimate were presented as compassionate fixes to documented problems. They passed because millions of Americans and the legislators who represented them genuinely believed they were making families more humane, and in the short term they were right about that. But the speed is what should concern you. From California in 1969, the change swept the nation in under a decade. The same legislatures that once guarded family continuity voted to dismantle it. The same governors signed the bills. If you have watched the previous video on this channel about what happened to the American family line, you already know the individual cost. What stable homes looked like before, what they looked like after. This is the other side of the same door. Because the individual was not the only entity diminished, the family unit was diminished alongside them. And unlike the individual, the families did not vote directly, but their representatives did on their behalf. I want to be honest about something. I spent days with this research before writing a single word. Not because the numbers are in dispute. They come directly from the Census Bureau, the Congressional Research Service, and scholars who track family structure. I sat with them because there is a version of this story that is perfectly reasonable. Laws evolve. Social norms shift. Societies modernize over time. The specific data point that nearly satisfied me was the decline in two-parent homes. A reasonable person could look at that arc and see normal adaptation. Families found new ways to arrange themselves over decades the way any institution adapts. That reading almost held. What broke it was realizing that families did not actually diversify into independent structures. What replaced the old family line was state-mediated support. Families did not find new ways to maintain continuity. They found a new patron, and the patron arrived with requirements that shaped family policy from the outside. The families traded independence for dependence so gradually that nobody alive remembers what the independence felt like. The transformation tracked by scholars shows government involvement rising from minimal levels in the 1960s to dominating the support for single-parent households today. Every expansion of welfare programs, every new child support regulation, every added oversight represented a decision made in state capitals. Those decisions were made by legislators who no longer answered solely to the family structures that once defined their districts. Every conditional grant represented leverage over family budgets. Every public dollar came with strings that shaped priorities and directions chosen not locally, but centrally. The machinery of dependence was assembled one appropriation at a time across 50 years until it became the primary support for millions of broken lines. You live inside the structure those votes created. Whether you know it or not, you interact with it every day of your life. Every time a court calculates child support, you participate in a system that state legislatures voted into existence, expecting it would only touch the most difficult cases. Every time your child's school receives funding tied to family status, that negotiation happens within a dependency framework those same legislatures built. You have seen families rely on government assistance programs. Your neighbors navigate child custody arrangements shaped by no-fault rules. The hospital where you or someone you love receive care operates within a system that now constitutes a massive share of all family support. None of this is hidden. All of it traces to votes cast in state capitals by legislators who could not have imagined the world those votes would build. So what would American families look like if those legislatures had called the bluff? If they had voted no on no-fault divorce exactly as some early opponents assumed they would? What if courts still required proof of fault before dissolving a marriage? What if the legal distinction of legitimate birth still carried structural weight? What if the state had no mechanism to distribute conditional support that now exceeds hundreds of billions annually? These are not conspiratorial questions. They are structural ones. The reforms were well-intentioned. That is not in dispute. The question is whether anyone in those capitals could have foreseen what they were authorizing. Whether they imagined a procedural change becoming the engine of the largest family intervention apparatus in human history. Whether they understood that removing the old safeguards would sever the family's only mechanism for resisting external expansion. Whether they pictured tens of millions in assistance becoming over $500 billion. The architecture they voted for did exactly what architecture does. It shaped everything built inside it. And what was built inside, it was a half-century of fragmentation that no one voted for and no one can now reverse. The two-parent household rate was near 95%. It is now below 60% for births. The out-of-wedlock birth rate was under 5%. It now exceeds 40% nationally. The family line answered to its own rules. It now answers to courts' caseworkers and conditional grants. The legislatures convened the votes themselves. They passed the reforms themselves. They surrendered their family's legal continuity, their economic independence, and their cultural leverage in a single decade by their own hand in their own chambers. The records are public. The vote tallies are preserved. A handful of legislators across the nation said no. The rest said yes. And now families survive on whatever the state decides to send them under whatever conditions the state decides to impose. The Capitol buildings still stand. The legislatures still meet inside them. The nameplates change. The gavels still fall. But the power that once lived in the family line left decades ago. And it left because the people who held it voted to let it go.